at the end of the 1970s, there was a trend to start to measure performance of academics and no longer take for granted that researchers would compete or would perform well. This created the incentive to use indicators. At the same time, coincidentally, the Science Citation Index was created. And this started in the 1950s, but I think until somewhere in the 80s, the Science Citation Index was actually not being used much. And this changed because starting with medical researchers, funders and governments wanted to know more about how the money they were investing in research was being used. And did it lead to seriously useful knowledge or not? And this created an incentive to use more quantitative performance indicators in and around the scientific system. That was increasingly, this led to the incorporation of citation data in also evaluating individual research groups, and certainly at the research universities. This was made easier in 1995 when the journal impact factor became easily available through the web. So that's created another impulse to then basically use that as an indicator of the quality of the journals in which people were publishing. And in some way that made sense, but in another way it created a perverse effect, a perverse incentive to narrow down, to basically narrow the definition of scientific performance to just publishing in high impact journals. This is still clearly visible in the career requirements in medical hospitals, for example. And it made it difficult for fields and researchers in areas where those journals simply don't exist, or where scientific performance requires other things like creating prototypes to be useful in technical sciences and engineering, or creating more cultural performances in the arts, or writing books for the general public in the humanities. This was then subsequently, I think, reinforced because of the invention of the Hirsch Index in 2005, which was, and the Hirsch Index is an interesting example because it is an example of a mix of a size-dependent and a size-independent indicator. And it's a mix of a publication-based indicator and a citation-based indicator. I think that around 2010, we see a switch again, in which people start to realize that the disadvantages of this citation focus and indicator focus becomes more visible. And what we're now seeing is a trend towards a more responsible and diversified way of evaluating researchers. So we need to transform the system as a whole, but we could start with creating indicators and using indicators that make those kind of diversity and inclusivity issues visible. So sometimes I'm pleading for more indicators, but in a different way. And what I mean with making context visible, or with context-sensitive indicators, they are indicators that are either able to measure the context or make that context sensitivity visible. But it makes a big difference if you are in the business of publishing in a medical discipline or in a mathematical discipline. where the numbers are very, very different, and the number of authors is very different. So the whole scientific community has a different size. So being aware of those contextual differences is an important challenge if we are using so-called objectifying indicators. So that's, I think, the key argument. I still think that we should not try to capture everything into indicators. It's probably better to use indicators in a qualitative context and to keep that qualitative context open for change and communication and not close it down.
The measurement of scientific success is, of course, a very difficult issue. It's a very difficult question. Today we have tools at hand where we can easily measure an indicator, and these indicators are often also used by administrations of universities, by funding agencies, in order to find out how good a scientist is. And good is a relative word, because it's only one indicator of a complex landscape, and measuring impact factors in journals and measuring citations is a way to measure really what the response is in the community. It doesn't immediately correlate with quality, and I think these concerns have to be always taken into account. I have been socialized scientifically in the Dutch science system, and I have been heading a chair for 10 years. And in that period, I was evaluated by an evaluation committee 2 times. And the basis of this evaluation was a citation analysis. This was done out of the Leiden Institute, performed very rigorously, and today all that prior work that they put into this methodology is today also in databases that we are currently using to find out how a field develops. But at the time, this was a basis of a judgment. It was a basis of how much impact somebody would have with so-called field citation impact factors. The Dutch system has been moving away from this purely numerical basis, but moved into a new standard evaluation protocol in which quality and direct access in meetings and evaluation in meetings is more important than the pure numerics. So I think that is a very important trend. We should look at this, what's called the standard evaluation protocol. It focuses on quality and not so much on numbers. It focuses on local conditions where researchers work and the strategy of the organization and how the persons and the person's research profile fits to that. And that, I think, in the context has to be evaluated and not only the pure numbers.